In this video, I'll show you how I painted these pansies in watercolor step by step. This is a painting with complementary colors. Watch until the end to see the whole process, and I know you can do it too. I started with a simple sketch, but I also provided a black and white outline so you can paint these pansies too. I also added some leaves so the bottom won't look empty. Check the description box to download the free outline drawing. I use a Lightpad to transfer the outline drawing to the paper as neatly as possible. If you want to see the process of transferring the drawing to the watercolor paper, you can watch the video by clicking the card in the upper right, or you can watch later and see the link in the description box below. I used a loose sheet of Baohong Academy cold pressed watercolor paper and masking tape to tape on my artboard. To mask a drawing, I have a diluted liquid dishwashing soap, an old synthetic round brush size 4, and Graphigum masking fluid. I pour a small amount of the masking fluid into my ceramic palette. I dip my brush into the liquid soap, then remove the excess water, dip it into my masking fluid, and apply it to my paper. I repeated this process until I finish masking the drawing. I mask the drawing because I want to preserve the drawing and avoid painting it while I paint the background. I didn't cover the whole drawing because I could avoid painting the middle parts while painting the background. Once the application of the masking fluid was done, I left my paper alone to dry and took a short break. As a tip, do not use any heating tool in drying the masking fluid because it can ruin your paper. Another tip, I use an old synthetic brush to apply masking fluid for easy application, and avoid using any expensive brush because the masking fluid can destroy it. For the background, I prepared these color mixes: sap green with a bit of English red ochre, sap green, Payne's gray, and a bit of Dioxazine Purple, Payne's gray, and permanent mauve. I use a Princeton Neptune round brush to paint, and I use this Art Secret flat brush 30mm to wet my paper. With clean water, I brush the paper section by section. I avoided wetting the flowers, just the sides. I let the paper absorb the water first, then I waited for 30 seconds, then I applied another layer of water. I made sure there were no puddles of water on the paper and no dry areas as well. Then I brushed with tea consistency of the colors. This is a simple background painting. I didn't copy what it is from the reference photo. It is like a camera shot in which the focus subject is the flowers. When I saw some areas were getting dry, I ran my damp flat brush to wet the dry area again before putting the paint on. If you find this video helpful, kindly tap the like button. If you want to see videos like this, subscribe and make sure you have the bell notification on so you'll be notified if I upload a new video. When I saw the background colors were getting dry, I flicked my brush to create splatters for the cauliflower effect and some with paint, then I let it dry. Once the painting has completely dried, it's time to remove the masking fluid using a rubber eraser. It's faster and easier to take off the masking fluid with a rubber eraser than using my fingers or a hard eraser. I also made sure there was no dried masking fluid and brushed the paper again and again before painting the pansies. I used a 4H pencil to redraw the lines that had been erased by the masking fluid as my guide. I found the reference photo in a splash, but I simplified the background for this painting. I wet a petal first, and then I used a tea consistency of French ultramarine to paint the dark areas of the flowers with purple petals and leaves. I used permanent mauve for the yellow areas of the flowers. These are the shadow areas of the flowers and leaves. I painted petal by petal on wet technique. These colors are the undertone colors of the flowers and leaves. If you add yellow on top of the purple, it will show gray or brown. If you add purple on top of the blue, then it will be more of the blue side. For my purple, I mixed Quinacridone Rose and Phthalo Blue-Green shade. I have also Quinacridone Gold and New Gamboge in tea consistency. In painting the flowers, I painted them petals by petals. I used the big round brush to wet the paper, and I used a smaller pointy brush to add colors. I started with tea consistency. It means I painted light and I built the colors as I went. For the yellow pansies at the top, I used Quinacridone Gold because it appears darker than the pansies at the bottom. For each petal, I painted them wet on wet, so you would see I switch brushes all the time. Using two brushes simultaneously helped me save time in washing my brush and removing excess water. As I painted the pansies, I look at the reference photo from time to time to see the colors, the shadows, and other details. I didn't copy as it is in the reference photo, but at least I have an idea. In this petal, I wet the whole petal first, and then I added Quinacridone Gold, and while it was wet, I added a purple mix, and then I let the colors blend. Painting using the wet on wet technique helps the colors have a smooth transition. Even if the colors are complementary or the colors on opposite sides of the color wheel, the yellow and the purple did not create brown or gray. I softened the edges of this petal and I didn't put color much on the edges as it shows in the reference photo. I added the link to the reference photo in the description box, so check it out if you would like to paint these pansies and follow along. I tried to avoid adding paint near the middle of the pansy. I messed up a little, but it's okay. I do not paint hyper-realistic anyway. Every flower is different, so it's fine. If you are a beginner in watercolors or painting in any medium, one tip I can share with you is you can always simplify your painting. If your goal is hyper-realistic, then go. It's your art anyway, and every artist is different. I move it to the next petal below. I wet the petal first using the big round brush, and then I added a tea consistency of the purple mix. This petal is also curvy, so I painted it with curvy lines. I mentioned tea consistency and I will talk about others later. If you want me to make a video about watercolor consistency, type in the comment section below. I'll be happy to help everyone who watches my video learn more about watercolors. As I painted these pansies, I also looked at the reference photo. I have the reference photo on my phone, so I can always zoom in and out to see the details. This petal is yellow in the middle and purple on the sides, so I painted with water first for wet on wet, and then I dropped some Quinacridone Gold. While the petal is wet, I added purple so the colors blend nicely with a good transition. I'm starting to build my mailing list, so if you would like to be updated on what I do, like in new watercolor tutorials, some information about watercolors, etc., you can sign up to receive emails from me. You can see the link on the description box. This flower is touched by the sun, so this flower should appear lighter. However, there's a shadow on the top of the flower on the right reflecting it. I'll work on the shadow later, but first I painted this using Quinacridone Gold with tea consistency. I added some paint to make this petal darker in some areas, but not the whole petal, so it won't look flat. Adding contrast to your painting can help to have shape, form, and dimension. As much as possible, I started painting light because it is easier to add saturated colors rather than correcting your mistake. Unlike other mediums, painting with watercolors is from light to dark. I also avoid adding colors to the areas that are white in the reference photo. I added a tiny amount of paint to some white areas to have a hint of the color, but then still I softened it. If the petal is curvy, I painted it with curvy strokes. It helps to develop the shape and form of the petal, and then I added more color on the darker or shadow areas. This petal has two colors, so I wet the petal first, and then I added Quinacridone Gold on the middle part going out, and then I added purple while the petal is wet. If you notice, I always paint in a wet on wet technique. Wet on wet is a technique in watercolor in which you will wet the paper first, and then you can add paint while the paper is still wet. This technique can give good color flow on the paper. It is easy to correct mistakes and lift colors. I like the curvy petals on these pansies. It's easy to capture attention, and with the color combination, the flowers are good for the eyes. There are a lot of pansy color combinations you can see, but this one has nice complementary colors. Although the purple has some parts with a reddish tone, so I will add another color later on. There's a small part of the petal at the back, and I painted it with a very light purple mix. Petals are overlapping, and later I'll show you how I show dimension and division on the overlapping petals and leaves. This petal is more yellow, but it is the flower that faces the source of light. Even if this petal is yellow, I added more Quinacridone Gold in some areas. In that way, this petal will appear more rounded and curvy rather than making it look flat. Some beginner's question I always see on the Facebook groups is how to avoid making the painting look flat. My answer to that question is adding contrast and paint following the shape. I mean, if you are painting something round like a ball or balloon, you shouldn't paint with straight strokes, but you make round strokes. Also, knowing your source of light is good so you can also determine the shadows. Don't be afraid to add saturated colors, but be mindful about starting light. For the leaves, I have a mixture of Quinacridone Gold and French Ultramarine. You can have more flexibility in mixing your green. You can make it earthy by adding brown, or you can make it bluish or more on the yellow side, or mute the green by adding a bit of violet, or make it darker by adding a bit of red. I still use the sap green and green gold in my watercolor palette, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just, for me, it's always a practice to mix your colors. Every time I pick up my color mix, it's different. Sometimes it's more yellow and sometimes it's more blue. I painted some parts of the leaves blue on the first layer, so when I added green on top of them, the color was more blue, and some shadows made it easy for me to adjust the colors on the next layer. In this stage, the painting looks ugly and dull. As much as possible, I kept the details last. For now, I'm trying to build the foundation of the colors. Sometimes it's tempting to paint the details early, but having patience and keeping the best for last is worth the wait. I mix Quinacridone Gold, Phthalo Blue Green shade, and Quinacridone Rose for the shadow areas of the yellow petals. I wet the petal first and I drop my shadow color, but I found my color a bit much. Anyway, I can make adjustments later or cover it with details. I didn't cover the entire petal, but only where it shows a reddish brown color. In painting this petal, I started adding saturated purple in milk to cream consistency. It means that the watercolor mixture I have is middle to mid-dark tone. It's thicker, darker, and more saturated than the previous one. I have more pigment than water, and the paint doesn't move quickly in my palette. You will notice the color is getting darker and saturated as I paint, but then I soften the edges because the pansies in the reference photo have white edges. I added shadows on the edge of the next petal at the right. These petals are overlapping, so when something overlaps on another, there will be a shadow behind the other. I also added darker and curvy strokes to enhance the shape. If you find this video helpful, kindly tap the like button. If you want to see videos like this, subscribe and make sure you have the bell notification on so you'll be notified if I upload a new video. I added a small amount of Quinacridone Magenta on some parts of the petals to add more reddish tone while the paper was still wet. In that way, the colors will blend nicely and it will dry without hard edges. I added more new Gamboge on this petal using the wet on wet technique, and then I added the reddish shadow color I mixed earlier. This time I was starting to create depth and curves and slowly showing the form of the petal. The folds of the petals are more noticeable than earlier. Just like the previous petal, I added more of the new Gamboge and shadow color using the wet on wet technique. In this stage, I'm building the colors more and adding more saturated colors. This is the part where you will notice changes in your painting because there will be contrast and the shapes will be more visible. For me, painting can take time, but with patience, you will see the difference in your work from the start until you finish it. It took me 2 days to finish the painting. I can't finish in one sitting because I have a baby to take care of. If I paint this in one sitting, probably it will take me 4 to 6 hours. I took breaks, and that's important. When you come back with fresh eyes, you can paint more with details, and you'll see which part you need to enhance. I went back to the purple petal at the top to add Quinacridone Magenta and Purple mix. I hope you are learning by watching this watercolor tutorial. My goal in my channel is to help aspiring watercolor artists learn to paint using watercolors. You can also check my other watercolor painting tutorial playlists. I added a link to the description box below where you can watch them. I added Quinacridone Magenta on some of the petals and purple on the edges of some petals as shadow. I went back to the other purple petals to add Quinacridone Magenta, but I wet the petals first before adding a new layer of paint. I only do wet on dry technique when I'm painting details. For this stage, I'm still building up colors. That's the reason I still do wet on wet technique. I soften the edges of the petals to remove harsh brush strokes. I want the brush strokes to be smooth and no hard edges. In painting these petals, I keep in mind the petals are curvy. Sometimes I forget, so I add thin pencil marks before painting, and it helps me to remind myself about the shape and form of the subject I paint. In this stage, I continued adding milk to cream watercolor consistency of purple mix with Quinacridone Magenta on some of the petals. For the yellow petals, I added milk to cream watercolor consistency of Quinacridone Gold and my mix of reddish brown shadow. For the next few minutes, enjoy the music while watching this video. I'll come back later to explain the next process. If you find this video helpful, kindly tap the like button. If you want to see videos like this, subscribe and make sure you have the bell notification on so you'll be notified if I upload a new video. In painting a third layer of leaves, I have a milk consistency of Quinacridone Gold and French Ultramarine mix. I painted the darker areas and I left some parts untouched. Some of the leaves do not exist on the reference photo. I just added them to simplify the leaves at the bottom. These leaves are overlapping, so I added darker tones on the edge of the leaves beside it. Adding saturated color can help the other part beside it to pop up more. I fixed the shape of the leaves and I added shadows to help the leaves show there are multiple leaves overlapping with each other. I added more Quinacridone Gold on the shadow areas of some yellow petals to define the shape of the petal folds. I also added cream consistency of the purple mix on some petals to define the shape and division of the petals. In this way, it can help to show the petals are overlapping with each other. I mix the purple and the reddish brown mix I have in my palette to create another color of dark brown, and that's what I use to paint the details or the lines of the pansies. This time the watercolor consistency I have is cream consistency. I diluted the black mix I have for the shadow reflecting from the pansy at the right. This shadow is the most visible one than the other shadows. I was getting some metallic gold. This is Daniel Smith Iridescent Antique Gold to add shimmers to the painting. I got the paint directly from my palette instead of putting it first into my mixing palette. I didn't mix it with other colors, and it's best to get from the palette or fresh from the tube. I have this whitewash from Holbein to add some thin lines or veins to the petals. Once the painting has completely dried, I remove the tape. I hope you learned something in this watercolor tutorial. You can check out this playlist to watch more of my tutorials. Remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel to watch more tutorials like this.